we are very pleased to have Dan Kim with us. He has developed a tool using artificial intelligence that can help you to perform some basic research tasks within the actuarial function and within any function for that matter. Dan, we want to welcome you, and why don't you take a minute and introduce yourself and maybe let people know where they can find this tool that we're going to talk about.
Well, thank you for having me. So I'm Dan Kim. I'm an actuary and I work at American Equity in the actuarial function. I built this tool, the AI tool, as part of my personal interest. So I took time on weekends or non-working time to work on it because I was so interested. When these large language models came out, I thought it was so interesting. I love thinking about how do we know things that we know. And it somehow seemed like this model, it's a predictive model, but somehow it seems to know what I'm asking and providing the responses. And I thought, oh, I could use it, learn about it, and also try to make some tool that could be useful. So that's where I thought, hey, from this actuarial world, how can I get help? And I often refer to actual documentations. I think about, hey, what if I'm reading a documentation for the first time? If someone could guide me, hey, this document is about something, and there's an introductory summary that someone can help me with. And also, there's someone, for example, I work on Bermuda too. So in Bermuda, there are 8 interest rate scenarios. What was the number 6 and 7 to be more specific? Then I need to go and read the documentation. Then I thought, can I just create a tool that can help me with that? So that was the motivation in creating this tool. What this tool does is I uploaded a collection of actual documentations, and this tool searches based on my questions. And then the large language model, based on those contexts that the process queried, and there's some context that goes into the large language model, and language model interprets for me.
That's really interesting, and it's great that you're making this available to everybody to use. We're not going to get into the details today, but what language did you write your program in? For those who are interested, I know you provided some of the code for
Yeah,
people to look at. What is
right.
it written in?
So I used Python. So Python is the most popular language right now for AI engineers or natural language processing work right now. So I naturally use the Python as a tool. I didn't really build or develop the large language model. And actually, there are service providers providing those, so the core engine of AI, so large language models, or there's some open source that I could use. So actually, I provided a code in GitHub. So GitHub is another popular website where developers can upload their own codes, and I did the same so that anyone interested can go to GitHub and download all the codes and all the actual documents, by the way, because I just use public information. Another thing I've done is I created a Jupyter notebook so that you don't even need to create some website. You could just run the Jupyter notebook to achieve the similar thing, creating summary, doing the Q&A as well.
Let's get into some specific questions about your tool and what audience you're looking to serve with this. Specifically to actuaries,
Mhm.
what tasks are you hoping to improve with your AI tool? Maybe provide an example.
So one was really the search, the quick search tool. And if I think about the traditional framework, the search means I have to know the exact keyword. Is it an interest rate or is it an yield curve? I have to know the precise word so that it goes through the PDF file. Before that, even I have to know what PDF file I need to open up. It can skip all those processes because all those texts are transformed into mathematical representation called embedding, or it's a more of a vectors of the numbers. And it searches based on similarity of the meanings. So those vectors are created based on the meaning. So I don't need to remember whether it's interest rate or yield curve, whichever will give me the same answer because it's based on the meaning. What that means is it can be used for quick search and large language model providing and making some interpretation for me. So that's one good use case. And another use case is really, it can be a good gateway to anyone going into the technical documentation. And it's a bit intimidating to try to read, let's say, 500-page documentation, or the great example is the valuation manual. It's so lengthy that you have to almost know before going into that. If you're a new hire or just a fresh junior staff trying to read it, you shouldn't rely on it, but it can give you a quick guidance of what it's about and roughly where you can find the information that you're looking for.
Yeah, I think people at any point in their career would find this really, really useful, perhaps looking at different documents
Hmm.
as they go.
Hmm.
So what were some of the challenges you faced from the AI aspect of developing this tool?
Hmm. Like for any other language models, the biggest challenge is the hallucination, meaning it providing the false information. So the problem is 100% of the time, I'm getting the response that's very fluent. If you get a response that's very fluent and plausible, you almost want to believe it. But the problem is, it is relatively accurate because I'm uploading the ground truth, which is the actual documentation, without just relying on generic knowledge of the large language model. For example, you could just go to ChatGPT 4 and ask some questions about some actual topic, then it's going to provide you an answer. But the success rate is 60%, although 100% of the time it's going to be fluent, then you have to think about how do I differentiate the 60% versus the wrong 40%. But now, since I'm providing the ground truth, it's closer and it's more accurate, but it's not perfect. So in a sense, it's 80, 90% accurate, but again, it has the same problem. How do I tell if the answer is not the wrong 10%, but the right 90%? So that's the real question I've been facing with. The other challenge is my psychology. Once I keep seeing the answer that's plausible and that I want to believe, and I really think at some point I lose my critical thinking and I just think, oh, because this tool just provided me the answer, I just want to trust it without going further invalidating. So I get some lazy and I just want to just end at that point. Oh, I get the quick answer and I move on. So that's another challenge I'm still facing with.
Yeah, that reminds me of the story that came out last year about the lawyer that used ChatGPT to do his
Mm,
research and then relied on what turned out to be a hallucination. Uh,
exactly,
it's
exactly.
it,
Yeah.
it you almost have to have some
Hmm.
knowledge to be able
Yeah.
to kind of
Hmm.
truth check it.
Just last night, I came upon a
Hmm.
suggestion to ask ChatGPT to give its confidence level for an answer. And
That's
I
a great
tried
idea.
that, and it gave a percentage, and it gave itself very high percentages for the questions that I tested it on. So I haven't
Hmm.
yet been able to figure out what question it's going to give me one where it has low confidence in it.
No, that's a great idea actually. And that's actually what I have in my ChatGPT system prompt. I say, give the credibility and confidence of your response. Whenever ChatGPT responds to my question, it says, oh, it's almost likely, or it's plausible, or it could be right or wrong. So it provides me with that, but and that response again has some error as well. So that
Oh
was
no.
a challenge. Uh, and that's a great idea. And that was the idea of being transparent on the accuracy of the information, and but also being transparent about the source that the large language model is using. So that's actually the fundamental workflow that I built. And what I built is whenever I ask a question, then it spews out the raw context that it searched based on my query. If I ask for interest rate, then it's gonna use about 20 collection of the chunks that relate to interest rate. And I can read all of those directly, and I set it up the tool such that you can read them as if the and large language model is reading that and creating a response based on that context. So you can read the context, the raw context, and compare to large language models response so that you can verify yourself. And I thought if you cannot guarantee the 100% accuracy, then the more important thing is, can you be transparent and can you validate it?
So Dan, that's really interesting. How do you ensure the accuracy and reliability of your AI model?
Yeah, there are certain things you can do. One is, well, I am creating a workflow such that the large language model only responds from the documentation that's going into the process. In other words, it's not using generic knowledge. I'm trying to get the model to say, I do not know when the model does really know. I rather have the model say it doesn't know rather than say it knows something even though that's false, right? So I'm trying to prevent the false positives. I have a prompt saying, hey, if you cannot find the answer, just say you don't know. Sometimes I get those responses, it cannot figure out what I'm asking, then I'm more glad because oh then it's something I need to figure out how to reframe my question or just read the document instead of just relying on some false information. So that's one aspect. And the other aspect is you can just read those context that's retrieved and you can validate it. So that verification process. And it's a bit hard because it's it takes time and effort to do so. So my biggest challenge is another challenge, but is to how do I create a workflow and process such that it's painless to verify and nudge people to do so, even move on to reading the documentation without stopping at that point of getting the response from the model. And I feel this tool is more of a gateway. So it's more of a gateway to the actuarial documentation, and actual documentation is the destination that you have to go to. And I don't want people to think this tool is the ultimate goal that you can just fully rely on.
Yeah, and I can see easily users doing this with regulatory documents as well.
Mm-hmm.
Download
Mm-hmm.
the valuation manual
Mm-hmm.
and start doing things. But then obviously you need to double check and make sure that what it's giving you is accurate
Mm-hmm.
and what you want to do.
Mm-hmm.
Looks like, to us at least, Dan, that what
Mm-hmm.
you've offered in this latest release is
Mm-hmm.
something that, while you call it an actuarial tool, if I dumped in a non-actuarial document and asked questions, wouldn't it work for that as well?
It works perfectly well, actually. American Equity sells certain annuity product, and there's a public product brochure. And I was looking for some specific information about this product, and I tried to upload it and see how it works. And it was able to get me the answer to it. It gave me the summary of this brochure, what the key feature is, what the implication is, what key service offering it is.
Dan, tell me what new skills or knowledge do you think that an actuary or anybody else would need to start using these kind of tools?
Mhm. I think the biggest thing is the mindset or the interest. Some people don't even try to use it because either they think it's all hallucination or hallucination makes it unsafe to use. And the other side of it is they're just afraid to use it because they don't know or less interested. I want people to have this curiosity and just use it and just try yourself. The overall interface with large language model is the inputs the language, outputs the language. And once you start using it, what you're going to feel is it's like working with other person asking for something. Over the time, you build a skill to use the large language model using language itself. And if I apply the same rule to people, then once you start working with more people, you build your communication skill, you build your managerial skill. And I feel the same with these large language models. Over time, you iterate, you don't get your answer immediately, but over time, you know how to ask the question so that you get the response you want more quickly over time. So, and people often call it prompt engineering, but I feel it's just understanding what language, how to use it. I don't expect people to know the deep learning or the artificial neural network architecture to effectively use it, but just having a basic conceptual understanding what it can do, what it cannot do, and having basic understanding of this large language model will allow you to be more effective in using these AI tools.
Trial and error learning is great with these things, but sometimes you just don't even know enough to try the right things. Do you have any suggestions as to how somebody could get started, how they could learn enough of this prompt engineering or whatever
Mhm.
to at least make a reasonable try at using it?
So it all assumes that the person wants to learn. Then I think there are a lot of ways. There are a lot of open source, and you could even ask the large language model, how do I use you? And it's gonna give a list of good advices actually. So it's very interesting that even myself learned a lot from large language models. It looks pretty interesting. I asked large language model, what is the best way to frame it? It helps me decompose some of the complex questions into simpler forms, for example. And that simpler forms, large language model can answer better. So in that cases, large language model itself can be a very useful tool to learn things, but also there are a lot of folks who are open to teach. There are people on blog or YouTube who are willing to help, and I'm also part of it. I'm trying to help actors and anyone who's interested in more effectively using these tools. So I'm more than happy to chat or share codes. And that was my motivation to share codes as well. And also, I'm planning to present at Society of Actuaries conference and present on this topic to just talk about what it is, how you can get more interested, and I feel you learn more from a community, and I've learned so much from trying to learn, but I learned from other people as well.
How do you see this going with actuaries using this kind of tool? How do you see the job
Mm.
evolving?
Given how we've been using the technology, I feel it's gonna be embedded in our workflow a lot, and without us even knowing it. For example, there's a text completion in Word document or in Outlook email, and there's a text completion. I type I and it auto completes the sentence. That's another way of AI creeping into our day-to-day work. And another example is just creating a deliberate process to allow AI or any large language model to get more involved. So the AI tool I built is more involved, for example, or it could even perform some sentiment analysis and creating some scores or criteria or do some classification work, right? So there are a different range of how this AI tool could be used. And actuary's role, I feel, will become more like having more tool to use. But I don't think it should or will change the core decision making, because that decision making is not one dimensional. If it's a multi-dimensional, you have to think about the constraints, benefits, risk management, optimization problems. Once it gets complex, at least from the current technology, it's not the best tool to be used for those. So in that sense, actual judgments, decision makings will continue to be actuaries or people's role. The AI tools will be helpers of the actuaries, whether it being making actuaries more efficient or remove some of the redundancies or remove some of the tedious work.
There's a lot of discussion about bias
Hmm.
and how to avoid it and what the
Hmm.
concerns are. How are you addressing that within this AI tool and the data that it uses?
So that's a great question. And I'll be frank, I'm not addressing the bias. And there are bias creeping in a lot of places. So first bias is the actual documentation itself. Actual documentation shows certain views, whether it being from Academy of Actuaries or Society of Actuaries. They have their own view, and that's just uploaded without any filterings. there's also my bias too, because I'm selecting the document I like, document that I feel is useful. So there's another bias added onto the collection itself. And there's another bias embedded in this process. So this tool is doing the search, and it's doing the search based on the meaning. So if you think about the traditional search, it's search based on the keyword itself, but the current algorithm uses a search based on the meaning. And I use this example, the yield curve and interest rate, they have similar meanings in our mind. And model has to have implement that meaning into numbers. And in providing the meaning from word to numbers, there's a bias embedded in it. For example, men and women will have different numerical representation, but king and queen, but doctor and nurse. I mean, you get the concept where that the information out in the web and how do we perceive the bias, and in that mathematical representation, is the bias embedded there or not? For us, it's all black box. It's hard to, you can sort of see the numerical representations, but that process could include all those biases. And ultimately, this large language model is more of a compression of the text in web. And the text in web, there's no guarantee, and a lot of things are biased. And the large language model is biased, although developers of this large language models try to make it safe by trying to see what bias is embedded. And to some extent, that again is a value judgment. So in that sense, bias can never be removed. Over the whole workflow, from the data, how the query is being made, and how the large language model is being used, everything is flowing through some bias embedded in the process. So in a sense, bias is not addressed. So the core aspect of using it is to understand there's a potential bias in this workflow so that you take with a grain of salt.
It's fascinating, Dan, and I thank you. Is there anything, maybe give you an open-ended question? Is there anything that we haven't talked about today that you want to make sure that people become aware of?
No, I think we covered a lot. I just hope people get more interested and try this out, and in a sense, make a lot of mistakes. And I think the worst case is getting some answer that's quite realistic and plausible, so that it's really hard to tell if it's an error. But if you get a apparent error, then you immediately know it. So I hope people make a lot of apparent mistakes so that they build a framework to how to validate it, how to make things transparent, and in a sense, ultimately create some kind of a workflow to use it safely, but with accountability.